Hello and welcome. Today, we are diving deep into one of modern history's most influential and, let's be honest, most controversial ideas, socialism. It's a word that can really get a debate going, right? So our goal here is to just cut through all that noise and really get to the heart of what it all means. So, first things first, what does this word actually mean? You hear it thrown around constantly, a lot of times as a political weapon, and its definition can feel, well, pretty slippery. Is it an ideology, a movement, an economic system? The answer is kind of all of the above, which is exactly why we need to be crystal clear about what we're talking about. You know, what's really fascinating is that for a long time, words like socialism, communism, and social democracy were basically used as synonyms. But that all changed because of one single event, the Russian Revolution of 1917. That moment didn't just reshape the world, it completely shattered the socialist movement, creating these sharp, often hostile battle lines. And we are definitely going to explore that huge moment a little later. To make sense of it all, here's the plan. We'll start with a basic definition, then we'll break down its 5 core themes. After that, we'll look at that massive 1917 divide, take a quick trip around the world, and finally, check out its legacy and where it stands today. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Socialism didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was born as a direct reaction to the harsh realities of early industrial capitalism. You know, the sprawling slums, the brutal working conditions, and this massive gap between the factory owners and the workers that just seemed to get wider every single day. The name itself actually gives us a really big clue. It comes from the Latin word sociare, which means to combine or to share. So at its core, socialism is really a critique of a society that's built on pure individualism and competition. Instead, it champions the idea that we should focus on collective goals and tackle social and economic inequality head-on. And listen, while socialism comes in all sorts of flavors, from democratic to totally autocratic, most versions are built on just a few foundational pillars. So let's break down the 5 core themes that kind of tie it all together. These 5 big ideas are community, cooperation, equality, class politics, and common ownership. You can think of these as the essential ingredients in the recipe. Let's take them one by one. First up, community. Now, this is a direct challenge to the liberal idea of the rugged, self-sufficient individual. For socialists, we aren't just separate atoms bouncing off each other, we're fundamentally shaped by our social connections. It's a really strong belief in nurture over nature. They champion fraternity, this idea that we're all in this together as human beings. And that leads us straight to our second theme, cooperation. See, if community is the goal, then cooperation is how you get there. Socialists tend to believe that competition forces people to turn against each other, and it breeds selfishness. Cooperation, on the other hand, builds bonds of sympathy and care, which they see as both morally and economically better. Third, and this is a really big one, is equality. For socialists, this isn't just about equality of opportunity. They push for what's called equality of outcome. The argument is that huge gaps in wealth aren't because some people are just naturally more talented than others, but because the system itself is designed to be unequal. For them, social equality is the absolute bedrock of justice. Which brings us to theme number 4, class politics. This super famous quote from Marx and Engels really nails it. Socialists see class, your economic position in society, as the most important social division there is. And history, from their point of view, is basically driven by the conflict between the owners, the people who own the factories and the land, and the workers, who have nothing to sell but their own ability to work. And finally, we get to common ownership. Socialists argue that private property, and to be specific, they mean the private ownership of productive wealth like factories, companies, and land, is the root cause of all this injustice and class conflict. Their logic is, since wealth is created by everyone working together, it should be owned by the community as a whole, not by a few private individuals. Okay, so now that we've got the core ideas down, let's get back to that huge turning point. How did this big, united movement end up fracturing so badly? Well, the answer is found in one of the 20th century's absolute biggest events, the Russian Revolution. Before 1917, the socialist movement was really picking up steam. But then, World War I dealt it a massive blow. The central promise of international worker solidarity just shattered. Socialist parties in Germany, France, and Britain all voted to support their own countries, which meant they were sending workers to go kill other workers in the trenches. But the real final breaking point was 1917. When the Bolsheviks seized power, it forced every socialist on the planet to pick a side. It boiled down to one fundamental, irreconcilable question: how do you actually achieve socialism? One group, the Social Democrats, believed in a slow, peaceful, democratic path through elections and reforms. The other group, the newly named communists, believed that capitalism could only be destroyed through a violent revolution. This wasn't just a small disagreement, it was a deep, moral chasm that has defined the left ever since. So after this great divide, that communist branch of socialism went global. But it wasn't just a copy and paste job. As it spread around the world, it was totally reshaped by local cultures and conflicts. So let's take a quick world tour to see how it changed. First stop, the Soviet Union. As Lenin's quote makes pretty clear, his vision was unapologetically authoritarian. He came up with this idea of a vanguard party, a small group of elite revolutionaries who would lead the masses, and a system he called democratic centralism. Now, in theory, that meant open debate before a decision. But in practice, it meant once the party leadership decided something, all debate stopped and you had to obey, period. Now let's head east to China. Mao Zedong took this Soviet model and adapted it for a society that was mostly rural and full of peasants. This Sinification, or Chinese version, became known as Maoism. It was all about mass mobilization in a people's war, and this brutal idea of a continuous revolution to purge society of anyone who was seen as an enemy. Over in Latin America, the Cuban Revolution became this incredibly powerful symbol. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara set up a communist state just off the coast of the United States, turning Cuba into a huge Cold War flashpoint. From there, they actively tried to export their revolution, supporting anti-colonial and guerrilla movements all over the region. And in Africa, during the era of decolonization, a lot of newly independent nations started to adopt socialist ideas. Leaders like Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso blended socialist economics with a really powerful anti-imperialist message. For them, socialism was a tool to break free from economic dependency on their old colonial rulers and to fight the corruption that they saw as part of that ugly legacy. So, after all that, what is the legacy of these 20th century socialist experiments? Let's take a look at their spectacular collapse, the major criticisms they've always faced, and what relevance, if any, they still have in our world today. While the end of the Cold War happened incredibly fast, the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 was followed by the collapse of communist governments all across Eastern Europe. And then, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself just dissolved. Today, only a handful of states officially run by a single communist party are left. Of course, socialism has always had powerful critics. Liberals, like the economist Milton Friedman, argue that its focus on the collective group will always end up crushing individual freedom. Conservatives, like Winston Churchill, have often painted it as a philosophy of envy that just drags everybody down. And maybe most cynically, fascists, like Hitler, actually tried to steal the language of socialism to appeal to workers, while in reality, they were brutally crushing socialist movements and murdering their followers. And this really gets at the central tension that's still with us. While that authoritarian communist model largely collapsed under the weight of its own brutality and economic failure, the core questions that socialism first tried to answer, they haven't really gone away. Which leads us to our final thought for you to chew on. As long as there is significant poverty and economic inequality in the world, will the ideas of socialism, in one form or another, always find an audience?